September 14th, 1944. The bleeding edge of Aachen, Germany. Dawn did not break. It merely seeped through the smoke. The sky above was a bruised, suffocating ceiling of pulverized mortar, incinerated pine, and the atomized remnants of a dying Reich. What little light managed to penetrate the overcast gloom cast a sickly, jaundiced pallor over the shattered spine of a once prosperous farming community. And then, out beyond the splintered, skeletal tree line to the west, the American artillery began to speak. It wasn't a sound. It was a geological event. The 155mm shells hammered the earth with a rhythmic, bone-liquefying violence. You didn't hear the barrage with your ears. You felt it in the marrow of your shins. The concussions traveled up through the cracked leather of worn boots, vibrating through the skeletal system until they settled as a permanent, sickening ache in the pit of the stomach. Feldwebel Alaric Kalin pressed the nape of his neck against the jagged remnants of a brick kitchen wall. He was 26 years old. He possessed the birth certificate of a young man, but the deep, trench-like fissures carved into his forehead and the dark, bruised hollows beneath his eyes belonged to a ghost. He had been marching, fighting, and bleeding for the Wehrmacht since the arrogant, sun-drenched summer of 1940. He had survived the vast, freezing, unforgiving slaughterhouse of the Russian steppes. He had crawled through the brutal, claustrophobic meat grinder of the French hedgerows. Now he was looking at the very threshold of his homeland, and it was burning to the ground. Crouched in the debris beside him was Schütze Torsten, 17 years old, a frightened child swimming in a coarse wool tunic meant for a full-grown man. The boy was aggressively scraping a layer of greasy, foul-smelling cordite and soot from his chin using a rusted, painfully dull razor blade. His hand trembled with such violent, uncontrollable spasms that he had already nicked his sharp jawbone twice. A thin line of bright red blood mixed freely with the gray ash caked on his neck. Torsten did not speak. None of the men in the shattered remnants of their squad possessed the energy for words. They had been executing a tactical withdrawal for weeks. It was the High Command's sanitized, cowardly euphemism for running for their lives. Their field gray uniforms hung loose on starved, skeletal frames. Their boots were held together by dried mud, scavenged copper wire, and a stubborn, completely irrational desperation. The air inside the ruined farmhouse was stagnant and thick. It carried the metallic stench of fresh blood, the rot of gangrene, the sour musk of unwashed bodies, and the sharp chemical tang of high explosives. The floorboards beneath Alaric's boots were littered with the tragic debris of a civilian life extinguished in a matter of hours. A shattered porcelain tea saucer, a torn, ash-covered hymnal, gray soot drifting like snow through the blasted roof. Then, through the haze of total exhaustion, Alaric's eyes snagged on a shape, something that absolutely did not belong in a German home. Shoved into the far corner of the ruined kitchen, half buried beneath a collapsed, charred timber beam, sat a dense lump of heavy canvas. It was not the familiar, faded field gray of German military issue. It was an unmistakable, uniform olive drab. Alaric froze. He stared at the object, his veteran instincts immediately treating the unfamiliar shape as a fatal threat. He watched it with the breathless intensity one reserves for an unexploded mortar shell resting on a hair-trigger fuse. The artillery outside shifted a fraction closer, violently shaking the foundation and dropping a sudden cascade of fine white plaster dust onto his dented steel helmet. Slowly, ignoring the screaming, chronic ache radiating through his lower back, the Feldwebel pushed his weight off the wall. He crossed the room. He gripped the canvas strap. The material itself was a physical shock to his bare, calloused hands. It was incredibly thick, robust, woven with a tight, luxurious density that the German textile mills had been forced to abandon 3 years ago due to crippling raw material shortages. He dragged the heavy pack out from under the rubble, pulling it into the pale, gray light filtering through a blasted window frame. It was an American infantryman's backpack. The enemy had moved through this very house. Perhaps yesterday, perhaps only a few hours ago in the pitch-black pre-dawn. In this fluid, chaotic retreat, the front lines were not lines drawn on a map. They were bleeding, overlapping edges of terrified men hunting each other in the ruins. An American soldier had dropped this pack in a frantic hurry and simply moved on. Torsten stopped scraping his face. The rusted razor hovered an inch from his bleeding cheek. His sunken, exhausted eyes locked onto the olive-drab canvas resting at his commander's boots. Alaric unbuckled the main flap. The metal hardware on the straps was a quiet marvel of manufacturing. It was machined flawlessly. No sarpeggios. No stamped metal shortcuts. It snapped open with a smooth, oiled click that felt entirely obscene in the middle of a war zone. He peeled back the heavy canvas cover. Then the smell hit him. It was faint at first, masked by the thick canvas, but in a room that smelled overwhelmingly of death and despair, it was as sharp and startling as a bayonet thrust to the gut. It was the rich, dark, completely illogical aroma of roasted coffee. Alaric's hands, scarred, filthy, and caked with the dried mud of 3 conquered countries, reached cautiously into the depths of the pack. He pulled out a heavy, wax-coated rectangular cardboard box. The waterproofing was immaculate. The corners were sharp and unbroken. Stenciled across the front in stark, bold, black English lettering were the words, "Ration, Type K. Breakfast Unit." Torsten let out a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. It was a pathetic, involuntary animal noise. The young boy abandoned his rifle. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely ignoring the jagged shards of window glass cutting deeply through the knees of his uniform trousers. Alaric stared at the box resting in his palms. He dug his thumbnail into the wax seal and broke it. Inside, arranged perfectly like precision machine parts in a luxury engine, sat a small metal tin of processed meat, a packet of tightly compressed high-energy biscuits, a water-resistant matchbook for cigarettes wrapped in pristine, crinkling cellophane, and a small, foil-lined envelope, soluble coffee. The German army had stopped issuing real coffee to its frontline troops in the freezing winter of 1942. What Torsten, Alaric, and the rest of the hemorrhaging Wehrmacht drank now was a bitter, black sludge boiled from roasted acorns and chicory root. It was a phantom beverage, Ersatz-Kaffee. It temporarily warmed the stomach but offered absolutely nothing to the blood, the muscles, or the brain. Yet here, abandoned carelessly on the floorboards of a ruined German farmhouse, was the real thing. Alaric reached back into the pack. He pulled out 2 more identical wax-coated boxes. Dinner. Supper. The silence in the room grew suffocating. It felt far heavier than the relentless artillery barrage pounding the earth outside. The Feldwebel looked at the food spread across the dusty floorboards, and his veteran mind began to process a terrifying, inescapable mathematics. According to the meticulously calculated logistics of the American military, cold, hard data that would one day be quietly preserved in the National Archives, the American K-ration was never considered a luxury. It was a highly calibrated tactical weapon. Developed by Dr. Ansel Keys, a brilliant physiologist, the ration was scientifically engineered to provide exactly 2,830 calories per day. It was designed with a singular, ruthless, operational purpose: to keep a combat infantryman functioning at absolute peak cognitive and physical efficiency under the most extreme, exhausting stress imaginable. The calories prevented the mind from shutting down. The sugar kept the peripheral vision razor-sharp. The protein kept the trigger finger steady. Alaric slowly turned his gaze to Torsten's emaciated, trembling frame. The German supply lines had utterly disintegrated behind them. Rail yards were bombed into twisted nightmares of scrap iron. Supply trucks were relentlessly strafed by endless, unbothered swarms of Allied fighter planes. For the past 12 agonizing days, the standard daily caloric intake for Kalen's squad had plummeted dangerously below 1,200 calories. They were surviving on scavenged, rotting root vegetables pulled from the frozen mud of abandoned farms. They chewed on dense, heavy blocks of Kammersbrot, a military bread increasingly laced with sawdust to stretch the failing flour supply. It was meant to be rationed among 4 men for an entire week. An army marching on 1,200 calories a day does not fight. It merely waits for the inevitable moment it is asked to die. The American soldier who had carried this olive drab pack, A simple, low-ranking private judging by the completely standard issue and lack of specialized officer's gear, was carrying more raw nutritional energy on his back than Alaric's entire remaining squad had consumed in the last 72 hours. Alaric laid the 3 rations carefully on the floorboards. The wax paper seemed to glow in the dull, gray morning light. It was an offensive, arrogant display of wealth. It was a physical, stinging insult to everything the German soldier was currently enduring. Torsten reached out a trembling, filthy hand toward the breakfast ration. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and pleading silently with his squad leader. The boy was starving. The hunger was not a metaphor. It was a tangible, physical beast violently clawing at the inside of his ribcage, screaming to be fed. But Alaric did not nod. He did not grant permission. Instead, a profound, sickening realization began to settle deep in his stomach. It was a feeling far colder and infinitely heavier than the hunger he had lived with for months. He looked at the precise, uniform printing on the cardboard box. He looked at the perfectly sealed cellophane wrapping the cigarettes. This was not just food. This was an undeniable, terrifying broadcast of industrial supremacy. To supply millions of fighting men, moving them across the violent width of an entire treacherous ocean, sustaining them at the end of thousands of miles of highly vulnerable supply lines, and to ensure that a solitary, unnamed rifleman standing in a destroyed German kitchen had a perfectly preserved piece of hard candy and a dry cup of coffee. It was entirely incomprehensible to the German military mindset. The German high command demanded sacrifice. They demanded iron willpower, fanatical devotion, and a blind belief in the mythic, inherent superiority of their blood. They demanded that men like Alaric Kalin hold a collapsing line with broken, jamming rifles and empty, gnawing stomachs. The American command did not demand willpower. They engineered it. They boxed it in wax paper, sealed it against the rain, mass-produced it, and shipped it by the millions. Alaric closed his eyes and remembered the summer of 1941. The vast, dusty, seemingly endless plains of the Eastern Front. Back then, under the bright, blistering sun, they had felt invincible. The panzer divisions had swept forward like a mechanized scythe through golden wheat. But even then, at the absolute zenith of their terrifying power, the supply wagons trailing behind the steel tanks had been pulled by hundreds of thousands of sweating, dying horses. The mighty German war machine, the terror of the European continent, had always relied on the bleeding muscle of beasts and the desperate, brutal foraging of its men to survive. They had mistaken early, shocking tactical victories for structural, foundational supremacy. Now, staring at a simple cardboard box of food, Alaric was looking at the face of a true apex predator. The United States was not fighting a war of passion. They were not fighting out of deep historical grievance or twisted ideology. They were executing a massive, flawless, entirely unsentimental industrial equation. He picked up the small metal tin of meat from the breakfast unit. He turned it over in his rough hands. There was no rust. There were no dents. Stamped onto the bottom of the tin was a production date, barely a month old, and a location: Chicago, Illinois. Chicago, a city Alaric had only ever seen in faded pre-war photographs. A city entirely untouched by the horrors of bombing, completely unbothered by the terrifying, wailing screams of air raid sirens. A place where massive factories hummed steadily under bright, warm electric lights, 24 hours a day, turning out mountains of calories and steel to feed boys who would cross an ocean simply to kill him. Torsten's breathing was ragged, desperate. Feldwebel, the boy whispered. His young voice cracked violently, stripping away any lingering illusion of being a soldier. Please. Alaric looked down at the boy. If he let Torsten eat this American food, what would actually happen? The calories would grant him a momentary, powerful burst of physical energy. The concentrated sugar would light up his exhausted, dimming brain. But it would also plant a permanent, rotting seed of absolute, undeniable defeat deep in the boy's soul. To eagerly eat the enemy's perfectly prepared, scientifically balanced food, while their own leaders fed them hollow propaganda and sawdust, was to admit that their entire reality was a lie. It was a psychological poison, brilliantly dressed in a wax-coated cardboard box. The ground heaved violently again. The tremor threw both men hard against the brick wall. A shell impacted less than 200 meters away, the concussive wave instantly shattering the few remaining panes of glass in the house. A thick shower of pulverized brick and timber rained down heavily on their helmets. The dust thickened, coating the backs of their throats, choking them. Alaric coughed, shielding his eyes with his forearm. The Americans were getting closer. The barrage was methodically walking toward their position, deliberately clearing the grid square by brutal grid square. They needed to move. They needed to fall back again into the blinding smoke. He looked back at the olive-drab pack sitting open on the floor. The care rations were just the top layer. The canvas bag was still incredibly heavy. It possessed a bulk that implied further secrets. If food was a highly engineered weapon of morale and physical endurance, what else had the American war machine painstakingly packed for this solitary, faceless infantryman? Alaric's curiosity became a dark, morbid obsession. He felt a sudden, desperate need to fully understand the true nature of the beast that was currently hunting them into extinction. It temporarily overcame his veteran instinct to flee the incoming artillery. He plunged his hand back into the canvas depths. He pushed past spare pairs of socks woven of thick, warm, unfrayed wool. He pushed past a finely machined, locking entrenching tool that made his own wooden-handled shovel feel like a fragile, pathetic medieval relic. His calloused fingers brushed against a small, distinct shape attached near the bottom. It was a pouch, secured tightly with a sturdy metal snap, attached directly to the inside lining of the pack. It felt vastly different from the rest of the supplies. Felt dense. Felt critical. He unsnapped it with a sharp tug and pulled it out into the dim light of the ruined kitchen. It was a small canvas pouch, marked vividly with a red cross that had been only slightly dulled by field dirt. Alaric's brow furrowed deep in confusion. He looked at the pouch in his hand, then looked toward the shattered doorway, where the mechanical, grinding sound of the approaching American war machine grew louder, drowning out the artillery. He had been fighting on the front lines for 4 brutal years. He survived by understanding the rigid, unforgiving rules of combat. But this small piece of red-crossed canvas he was holding was about to violently shatter the last remaining illusion he held about the value of a soldier's life. In the Wehrmacht, medical care was a strictly centralized, often fatal game of chance. A German infantry platoon was typically assigned a single sanitator, a combat medic carrying a pair of worn leather pouches filled with rolled bandages, perhaps a pair of shears, and, if they were incredibly fortunate, a few glass ampoules of painkiller. When a German soldier took a jagged piece of hot shrapnel to the thigh or a bullet to the shoulder, his survival depended entirely on that single medic. If the sanitator was pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, if he was miles behind the rapidly collapsing line, or if his body was already lying lifeless in a ditch, the wounded man simply bled to death in the mud. The system treated the individual rifleman as a disposable asset, a single, replaceable gear in the great machine of the Reich that would be spent until the manpower completely ran dry. Alaric unfastened the brass snap of the American pouch. It opened with a sharp, clean sound. Inside, meticulously packed to utilize every available millimeter of space, was an individual first aid kit. Alaric pulled out a rectangular brass tin, sealed tight against the elements. Carlisle model first aid packet. Beside it rested a small, tough paper envelope. Alaric did not speak English, but the bold black letters printed across the front, sulfanilamide, were a universal language to anyone who had seen the horrors of a rapidly infected combat wound. Finally, carefully protected in a tiny, rigid cardboard tube, was a small collapsible metal tube with a needle attached. A morphine syringe. The cap was painted a vivid, unmistakable red. Torsten watched his squad leader, his breathing incredibly shallow and rapid. The boy recognized the medical supplies immediately. He instinctively reached up to touch the shoulder of his own uniform, right where a jagged piece of French shrapnel had grazed him 3 weeks ago. That shallow, minor wound had festered for days, turning a violent, angry purple because their unit had completely run out of basic antiseptic powder by late August. Alaric stared at the morphine syringe resting in his palm. The sheer manufacturing complexity required to mass-produce this single tiny item was absolutely staggering. It required sterile glass, precise metal extrusion, hermetic rubber seals, and the mass refinement of potent narcotics, all assembled in an immaculate, bomb-free environment, then shipped across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean just so a 19-year-old farm boy from Ohio wouldn't have to die screaming in a freezing Belgian forest. This was a profound, terrifying shift in the very philosophy of warfare. The United States War Department had looked at the fluid, chaotic, high-casualty nature of modern combat and realized that centralized aid stations were a massive vulnerability. Their solution, heavily documented in the logistical blueprints of the era, was as brilliant as it was breathtakingly resource-intensive. They decentralized survival. They did not just train thousands of medics. They turned millions of ordinary frontline infantrymen into autonomous mobile first responders. Every single American soldier who stepped off a steel landing craft or dropped from a silk parachute carried the immediate ability to stop massive hemorrhage. They carried the ability to pack a wound with antibacterial powder to stave off gangrene. They carried the ability to administer a military-grade narcotic to prevent their own nervous system from collapsing due to shock. They were engineered and equipped to survive entirely independently for a critical window of 72 hours. The American system mathematically multiplied survivability. The German system relied on stoicism, propaganda, and a high tolerance for dying. Alaric carefully slid the morphine syringe back into its protective cardboard tube. He felt a cold, hard, sickening knot tightening in the center of his chest. It was not the fear of combat. He had lived intimately with that fear for 4 years. It was an old, familiar friend. This was an entirely new terror. It was the creeping, suffocating dread of absolute, unavoidable obsolescence. He was looking at a nation that valued the life of its lowest-ranking, most expendable private enough to hand him a dedicated, scientifically perfected lifeline. A nation that protects its soldiers with that level of obsessive, industrial care is a nation that fully intends to march across the entire world. And absolutely nothing on earth was going to stop them. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath Alaric's boots heaved violently upward. The vibration was entirely different from the concussive shock waves of the falling 155mm artillery. This was mechanical. This was heavy, localized, and it was moving deliberately closer. From the street directly outside the ruined kitchen, perhaps less than 400 meters away, came the unmistakable, high-pitched metallic squeal of heavy steel tracks grinding against broken cobblestone. It was accompanied by the deep, guttural, earth-shaking roar of a heavy engine, not the sputtering, overtaxed, desperately whining Maybach engines of the surviving German panzer divisions. This was the steady, rhythmic, terrifyingly healthy thrumming of a massive, liquid-cooled V8. An American M4 Sherman tank was rolling directly into their sector. Torsten scrambled backward, his boots slipping frantically on the debris, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating panic. "Panzer," the boy hissed, his voice cracking violently, stripped of all composure. "Amerikanische Panzer." "Quiet," Alaric snapped. His voice was a low, commanding whip that instantly cut through the boy's rising hysteria. The Feldwebel dropped the medical pouch and instinctively reached for his own weapon resting against the shattered brick wall. The Mauser K98K bolt-action rifle. In 1939, it had been considered a masterpiece of military engineering. Beautifully milled steel, a smooth walnut stock, a bolt action that cycled with the slick, effortless precision of a heavy bank vault. But this was not 1939. This was the bleak, apocalyptic autumn of 1944. Alaric grabbed the rifle and violently ripped the bolt handle upward to check the firing chamber. Barely moved. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his forearms straining against the machined steel, and yanked again. The bolt fought him, grinding with a sickening, gritty, metallic resistance before finally snapping back. He looked down into the breach. The metal was heavily fouled with dark carbon. But the real, fatal problem lay in the ammunition pouches strapped to his belt. Alaric pulled out a stripper clip of 5 7.92mm rounds. The casings were not the bright, gleaming, flawless yellow of solid brass. They were a dull, sickly, mottled gray, because the massive Allied bombing campaigns had relentlessly pulverized Germany's industrial centers and entirely choked off their supply of raw copper. The Wehrmacht had been forced to rely on desperate, fatal substitutes. They were fighting with Stahlhülsen, cheap steel casings coated in a dark, inferior lacquer simply to prevent them from rusting in the damp air. But in the violent, blistering heat of a sustained firefight, the cheap lacquer melted inside the firing chamber. It acted like industrial glue, instantly welding the expanded steel casing directly to the chamber walls. To reload his weapon during a desperate ambush, Alaric frequently had to drop to his knees, find a heavy rock, and physically hammer the bolt open. His weapon was literally dying in his hands, betrayed by the collapsing, suffocated industrial heart of his own country. The Sherman tank's engine revved higher, the massive gears shifting with a brutal, mechanical crunch that shook the dust from the rafters. It was advancing slowly down the parallel street, casually clearing a path through the rubble, bringing a full platoon of heavily armed American infantry right to their doorstep. Alaric's gaze drifted back to the olive-drab backpack lying open on the floorboards. The wax-coated K-rations and the medical pouch had been pulled aside, revealing the heavy, dark canvas bottom. He reached inside one last time. His fingers met cold, heavy metal. It was wrapped securely in a thick layer of chemically treated paper, designed specifically to repel the damp, corrosive moisture of the European autumn. He pulled it out. It was a heavy cloth bandolier. Alaric tore the heavy wax paper away, exposing the deadly cargo within. 8-round en-bloc clips for the American M1 Garand rifle. Alaric held one of the heavy steel clips up to the pale light cutting through the smoke. The .30-06 caliber rounds were magnificent. They were a violent, perfect work of art. The brass casings were immaculate, gleaming with a flawless, golden finish. The heavy bullets were seated with exact, microscopic precision. There was no cheap lacquer. There were no desperate steel substitutes. There were no fatal compromises made by a starving, desperate nation. He ran his dirty thumb over the perfectly smooth brass casing. The manufacturing tolerances on this ammunition were an engineering marvel. This single round, manufactured in a sprawling, brightly lit factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, or Lake City, Missouri, was guaranteed to feed flawlessly, fire reliably, and eject smoothly every single time. It didn't matter if it was fired in the sweltering, humid jungles of the Pacific or the freezing, mud-soaked ruins of a German city. The American rifleman did not have to pull a heavy bolt back after every single shot. He simply pulled the trigger, and the meticulously engineered gas piston system of the Garand did the work for him, hurling an immense volume of lead downrange at a rate that made the German bolt-action rifles seem like primitive, tragic muskets. General George S. Patton had publicly called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. But the rifle itself was utterly useless without the vast, untouchable, oceanic infrastructure required to feed it. Alaric crouched in the dust, the pristine American ammunition heavy in his right hand, his jammed, compromised German rifle resting in his left. The contrast was absolutely devastating. It was not a comparison of two different weapons. It was the juxtaposition of two entirely different realities. By September of 1944, the United States of America was generating a staggering 50% of the entire global industrial output. Not half of the Allied output, half of everything being manufactured on the entire surface of the Earth. While historic German cities were being systematically erased from the map by thousands of heavy four-engine bombers, American factories were operating in perfect, uninterrupted safety. Shipyards in California were welding massive, ocean-going cargo vessels together in a matter of days. Textile mills in New England were churning out millions of yards of waterproof canvas. Massive foundries in Pennsylvania were pouring endless rivers of molten steel. Millions of women had confidently stepped onto the factory floors, operating heavy lathes and hydraulic presses, creating a relentless, overwhelming tidal wave of war material. The Wehrmacht was begging its citizens to donate church bells and cast-iron cemetery fences to be melted down for shrapnel. The American military was mass-producing millions of waterproof matchbooks and flawlessly wrapping individual cigarettes in cellophane. The psychological dam inside Alaric's mind, built over 4 years of intense, fanatical propaganda, finally cracked and gave way. The fear that washed over him was cold, absolute, and profoundly paralyzing. He realized, with a crystalline, heartbreaking clarity, that courage was entirely irrelevant. Tactical brilliance, combat experience, the willingness to lay down one's life for the fatherland. None of it mattered anymore. You cannot ambush a supply chain. You cannot outflank an ocean of raw steel. You cannot bayonet a factory in Detroit. He and Torsten, and the hundreds of thousands of starving, freezing German boys holding the rapidly collapsing line across Europe, were not fighting a human enemy. They were standing on the tracks, stubbornly trying to stop a runaway locomotive with their bare, bleeding hands. The ground shook violently. A large section of the ceiling collapsed in a thick cloud of choking, blinding white dust. The Sherman tank had turned the corner. It was right outside. Through the shattered window frame, Alaric could hear the heavy, methodical thud of American combat boots crunching confidently over the broken glass and brick. They were here. The operators of the great machine had arrived to claim the ruins. Torsten let out a terrified whimper and raised his jammed rifle, his finger trembling dangerously on the trigger. The boy was preparing to die for a lie. He was preparing to fire a defective bullet at an enemy who carried absolute salvation in his backpack. Alaric looked at the gleaming brass in his hand, then looked at the wax-sealed boxes of food still resting on the floor. The moment of truth had arrived, stripping away every ounce of ideology, leaving only the brutal, naked reality of survival and defeat. The heavy, liquid-cooled V8 engine of the American Sherman tank idled just inches beyond the shattered brickwork. It was not a sound, it was a physical pressure. The deep, resonant thrumming vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up Alaric Kalin's boots and settling deep in the marrow of his bones. Through the jagged remnants of the window frame, a thick, noxious cloud of blue diesel exhaust drifted into the ruined kitchen, mixing with the smell of pulverized plaster and the lingering, phantom aroma of American soluble coffee. Outside, heavy combat boots crunched over the debris. Voices cut through the idling roar of the tank. English, casual, confident, and dangerously close. They were not shouting in panic. They were communicating with the practiced, terrifying efficiency of men who knew precisely what they were doing, men who knew they were backed by a mountain of steel. Inside the kitchen, the air was stretched so incredibly tight it felt like it might snap and sever a major artery. Schütze Torsten was trembling violently. The 17-year-old boy was no longer looking at the window. He was no longer looking at his Feldwebel. His wide, bloodshot eyes were locked with a terrifying, animalistic intensity on the wax-coated cardboard box resting in the gray dust. The Kehrration, the breakfast unit, the human body, when subjected to the prolonged, agonizing deprivation of starvation, eventually strips away all ideology. It strips away the oaths of loyalty sworn to the fatherland, strips away pride, honor, and discipline. The primitive brain takes over, demanding fuel with a screaming biological imperative. Torsten let out a ragged, wet breath. His filthy, blackened fingernails scraped against the floorboards. He lunged forward. His hand shot out, desperate to grab the heavy cardboard box, desperate to tear through the wax paper and consume the processed meat, the sugar, the calories that the American industrial machine had so carelessly discarded. Alaric moved faster. The veteran's hand clamped down on Torsten's wrist like an industrial vice. The boy gasped, jerking his arm violently, trying to pull away, but Alaric's grip was absolute. Torsten looked up, his face twisted in a mask of agonizing confusion and profound betrayal. Tears of pure frustration cut clean, wet tracks through the greasy soot on his hollow cheeks. He mouthed a single, desperate plea for food, the word barely a whisper of air. Alaric looked deep into the boy's eyes. It was the hardest thing he had ever done in 4 years of relentless slaughter. He felt a profound, crushing sorrow for this starving child who had been handed a rusted rifle and told to stop the tides of history. But Alaric did not let go. If he allowed Torsten to tear open that perfectly engineered American ration, if he allowed the boy to taste the sweet, concentrated calories provided by the enemy, the war was over for them. In that single desperate bite, they would be admitting the complete, irreversible failure of the Reich. They would be acknowledging that their own leaders, the men who demanded fanatical sacrifice from the warmth and safety of their subterranean bunkers, had utterly abandoned them to starve in the rubble while the enemy fed its lowest privates with scientific perfection. To eat the enemy's food was to ingest the psychological poison of complete defeat. It was an admission that they were beaten, not just on the battlefield but fundamentally, structurally, and spiritually. It would break Torsten's spirit far more permanently than a bullet. Alaric slowly shook his head. His eyes were hard, flat, and uncompromising. He squeezed the boy's wrist once, a silent, grim command to hold on to the very last shred of his dignity. Slowly, agonizingly, Torsten stopped pulling. The fight left him all at once. The boy's shoulders slumped. He collapsed back against the brick wall, burying his face in his trembling hands, weeping silently into the filthy, coarse fabric of his uniform. Alaric turned his attention back to the olive-drab canvas pack. The heavy Sherman tank outside ground its massive gears. The tracks squealed in protest as the 50-ton machine pivoted on the cobblestones, the long barrel of its 75mm main gun sweeping past the window frame, casting a long, terrifying shadow directly across the floor. They had seconds left, perhaps less. Alaric Kalen moved with deliberate, stoic purpose. He reached into the pile of American wealth spread across the floor. He ignored the gleaming, flawless brass of the M1 Garand ammunition. He ignored the waterproof matchbooks and the pristine cigarettes. He ignored the heavy, wax-coated boxes of calories. He picked up only 2 items. First, the folding entrenching tool. He snapped the blade open and locked the collar. The machine steel clicked into place with absolute, rigid certainty. It was a tool of labor, a tool of pure survival. He hooked it onto his combat webbing. Second, the small, rigid cardboard tube containing the morphine syringe. He slid it deep into the breast pocket of his tunic. He did not take it to heal. He took it to provide a small, tragic measure of mercy to the next German boy he watched bleed out in the mud. Everything else, the food, the ammunition, the perfect waterproof map, the sterile bandages, he carefully placed back into the heavy canvas pack. He folded the thick olive-drab flap over the top. He pulled the heavy woven straps through the beautifully machined metal buckles, cinching them down tight. He was burying the evidence. He was closing the lid on a terrifying reality he could not afford to accept if he wanted to keep moving his feet. Alaric grabbed his jammed, useless Mauser rifle. He grabbed Torsten by the webbing of his harness and hauled the boy violently to his feet. He gave the command to move. They scrambled backward, crawling over the shattered remains of the kitchen wall, slipping through a blasted hole in the brickwork just as the front door of the farmhouse was violently kicked open by an American combat boot. Alaric and Torsten melted into the thick, choking gray smoke of the retreating German line. They became ghosts again, starving phantoms fading into the ruins of their own dying country. Behind them, the noise of the American advance swelled into a deafening, mechanical roar. It was not just one tank. It was an endless, rolling tide of mechanized power. Columns of 2.5-ton trucks were pouring into the city limits. They carried thousands of men, thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, millions of rounds of flawless brass ammunition, and an ocean of scientifically engineered calories. They were an unstoppable avalanche of steel and logistics, effortlessly crushing the horse-drawn, starving remnants of the Wehrmacht beneath their heavy rubber tires. Back in the ruined kitchen, the dust slowly began to settle. The air was quiet for exactly 15 minutes. Then, heavy footsteps echoed on the floorboards. An American soldier stepped through the shattered doorway. He was young, perhaps 19. He wore a steel helmet with the painted insignia of the Signal Corps. Over his shoulder, he carried a heavy spool of black communication wire, unspooling it as he walked to establish a forward command post. He was chewing rhythmically on a piece of gum. His uniform was dirty, but his face was full, his eyes alert. He was not a man fighting on the ragged, desperate edge of starvation. He was a man simply going to work. The wireman paused, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked around the destroyed kitchen, his eyes casually scanning the debris. Then he saw it. Sitting in the corner, exactly where Alaric Kalen had left it, was the olive-drab infantry pack. The American soldier did not draw his weapon. He did not approach the bag with the reverence or terror of a starving man finding a buried treasure. He simply walked over, dropping his heavy spool of wire with a loud clatter. He knelt beside the pack and unbuckled the straps. He flipped open the canvas flap. He saw the neatly packed K-rations, the spare ammunition, the heavy wool socks. He did not look surprised. He looked mildly annoyed that someone had left their gear behind to clutter the floor. The wireman reached into the bag and pulled out the breakfast ration. He did not tear into it with animal desperation. He casually broke the wax seal, rummaged past the compressed meat and the coffee, and pulled out the small, foil-wrapped piece of hard fruit candy. He unwrapped the candy, popped it into his mouth, and tossed the wrapper onto the dusty floor. Then, with a casual, dismissive shove, he kicked the heavy canvas pack into the darkest corner of the room. He did not need the perfectly machined ammunition. He did not need the perfectly engineered calories. He had his own pack outside. Every single man in his company had their own pack. The supply trucks were already idling at the edge of town, waiting to hand them more. The abundance was so absolute, so overwhelming, that a bag containing more life-saving material than a German squad had seen in a month was completely irrelevant to him. He picked up his spool of communication wire, turned his back on the pack, and walked out the door, whistling a low, tuneless melody. When we look back at the staggering violence of the Second World War, our memories naturally gravitate toward the great, sweeping narratives. We memorize the names of brilliant, towering generals standing over vast map tables in London and Berlin. We watch old, grainy film reels of daring paratroopers leaping into the dark, and armored columns clashing in the desert dust. We build monuments to individual courage, to the men who charged machine gun nests, and the pilots who burned in the sky. But courage alone does not win a modern war. Courage is fragile. Courage bleeds. Courage starves in the cold. Wars of global scale are ultimately decided in the quiet, humming expanse of the factory floor. They are decided by the anonymous men and women standing at the assembly lines in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago. They are won by the quartermaster staring at clipboards, calculating the exact cubic tonnage of cargo space required to ship 10 million bandages across a hostile ocean. The Third Reich built a military machine based on a twisted ideology of innate superiority and fanatical willpower. They built magnificent, overly complicated tanks that broke down in the mud. They relied on horse-drawn wagons to feed their men. They treated their frontline soldiers as a resource to be aggressively spent until the account was entirely empty. The United States built a military machine based on cold, hard, logistical mathematics. They understood a profound universal truth. A nation is only as strong as the institution that protects its lowest, most vulnerable individual. By designing a supply chain that viewed the common, nameless infantryman not as expendable cannon fodder, but as a highly valuable asset worthy of an immense, personalized investment, the United States fundamentally changed the calculus of human conflict. They handed every teenage private the calories to stay sharp, the medicine to stop his own bleeding, and the flawless ammunition to keep firing. They wrapped survival in wax paper and mass-produced it. In doing so, they created an army that was not just tactically sound, but psychologically invincible. Deep in the shadows of the ruined Aachen farmhouse, beneath a thick, settling layer of pulverized gray brick and ash, the abandoned American pack sat undisturbed. The canvas strap hung loosely. In the pale, fading afternoon light, the bold, black lettering on the discarded cardboard box remained perfectly visible. Ration, Type K. Breakfast unit. It sat there in the dust. A silent, perfect monument to the massive, unstoppable industrial gears that had long ago decided the fate of the world. Immaculate, untouched, and absolutely invincible. Thank you for staying until the very end. I hope today's video gave you some new perspectives. Please support me with a like and a subscribe. See you again soon.